Today we're jumping into two of the most charged phrases you'll hear in religious discussions: cult and different Jesus. You hear them thrown around a lot, but where did they actually come from? And more importantly, what happens when you put them to the test? Let's get into it.
So let's just start with the big one, the question that's been out there for decades. Why does the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints so often get hit with the cult label? To figure that out, we've got to go back to the source. We need to understand where this all started.
And to get to the bottom of this, we have to talk about one guy in particular, a Christian apologist named Walter Martin. His book from 1965, The Kingdom of the Cults, was an absolute bombshell. For a whole lot of people, this book was the final word on the subject.
Now this right here is the absolute key to the whole thing. Take a look at the definition Martin actually used. He wasn't talking about what we think of as a cult today, mind control, communes, stuff like that. His entire argument was theological. He was saying this group broke away from what he considered the essential, non-negotiable doctrines of Christianity, the beliefs that were hammered out in councils like Nicaea centuries after Christ. And this table basically lays out his case. These were his core disagreements. He looked at the nature of God, Jesus' relationship with the Father, the path to salvation, the use of additional scripture, and the idea of living prophets. And for him, these weren't minor differences. These were absolute deal breakers.
But here's where the story takes a really interesting turn. Because while Martin's ideas were hugely popular for a long time, the conversation among scholars, and even a lot of evangelical leaders, has completely flipped. Today, that cult label, it's pretty much seen as outdated, inflammatory, and just plain inaccurate.
And you can literally watch this shift happen over the decades. What Martin starts in the 60s becomes standard. But then by the 90s, scholars start pushing back, saying, hey, this word is causing more heat than light. Then in the 2000s, you get these major evangelical figures actually apologizing for using it. And now it's pretty much gone from any serious discussion. And this quote from Craig Blomberg, a really well-respected evangelical scholar, just nails the new perspective. He's not saying he agrees with the theology, not at all. He's just saying the cult label is the wrong tool for the job. It's more honest and more accurate, he argues, to just call it a different religion. That way, you can have a real conversation.
And then you have this, which goes even further. This isn't just an academic correction. This is a public apology from a giant in the evangelical world. In 2004, Richard Mile stood up and said that using labels like cult wasn't just wrong, it was a sin of misrepresentation. That was a huge moment.
Okay, so if the experts have pretty much thrown out the cult label, where does that leave us? It leaves us with the real issue underneath it all, the one that's often summed up with that other phrase: they worship a different Jesus. But what happens if we take that accusation and we just flip it around?
And this is the real kicker. The central question we're going to dig into now. If we're going to use the Bible as our measuring stick, how well does the traditional view of Jesus, the doctrine of the Trinity, actually line up with it? Is it possible that the traditional view itself is a different take than what the biblical writers were actually describing?
So, let's put these two models up on the board, side by side. On one hand, you've got the traditional Trinity, three distinct persons who are somehow also one single being, one essence. It's a concept that's often described as a mystery because, well, it's hard to wrap your head around logically. On the other hand, you have the Latter-day Saint Godhead, three totally separate beings who are perfectly united as one in their goal, their purpose, their will.
All right, so it's time to put both of these ideas to the test. And the rules are simple. We're not going to measure them against church councils or later traditions. We're going to measure them against just two things: direct quotes from the Bible and plain old logic. Let's start with Jesus' own words right here in the Gospel of John. He says it as plainly as you can: the Father is greater than I. Now, if you're just reading the text, that creates a bit of a logical puzzle for the idea that the Father and Son are co-equal parts of a single being. I mean, how can one part be both perfectly equal to and also less great than another part of the exact same being?
And it doesn't stop there. Here's another one, straight from Jesus. He admits there's something that the Father knows that he, the Son, does not. Again, this creates a real tension with the idea of a single, all-knowing God. If God is one being, and that being knows everything, how can one person of that being not know something the other person does? It's a logical knot.
So this forces us to ask a really direct question of logic, right? Can one single thing be, at the very same time, both equal and subordinate?
both all-knowing and not all-knowing. The argument here is that calling this a mystery isn't really an explanation, it's just what you call a logical contradiction that you find in the text.
So if we were going to score these two views purely on how logically they handle these specific scriptures, well, you see a pretty stark difference. The idea of separate beings is presented as logically consistent. Of course, one being can be greater than another, or knows something another doesn't. But the traditional Trinity, when held up against these specific verses, seems to contain some deep internal contradictions.
And that really brings us to the big takeaway from all of this. The argument being made here is that this whole debate isn't really about the Bible versus something else. It's about the Bible versus a tradition that was built on top of the Bible centuries later. And from that point of view, these labels, they're not really tools to find truth. They're tools to defend a tradition.
You can kind of see how this process happens. First, a simple truth is revealed in Scripture. Then, over time, people add their own interpretations, their philosophies, their creeds. Eventually, that tradition becomes the new standard. It becomes the lens through which everyone reads the original Scripture. And that's when you start getting confusion, trying to explain away contradictions. And, the argument goes, that's when a restoration, a return to the original plain truth, becomes necessary.
So, when you boil it all down, the argument is this. The labels cult and different Jesus, in this context, aren't actually biblical arguments. They are defenses of a very specific, post-biblical tradition. A tradition that, from this perspective, has its own serious challenges when measured against logic and the plain text of the Bible itself. And all of this leaves us with one final, big question to think about. Where does our ultimate loyalty lie? Is it with a tradition, no matter how old and respected it is? Or is it with what the Scriptures seem to say in plain language? It really makes you ask, when a truth gets buried under centuries of complexity, is it time for a restoration of simplicity?